Hi listeners, I'm your host Camilla Pintos Lopez and this is Eternal Stories. This podcast series is brought to you by Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries, New South Wales. For more information about the cemeteries and the work they do, feel free to visit their website at www.smcnsw.org.au. We'd like to begin this episode by acknowledging the Dharawal-speaking people, traditional custodians of the land, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. On our last episode, we took a deep dive into how ESMP came to be, so it's only fair to do the same for the other half. Woronora Memorial Park. While there are a few similarities between the two parks, Woronora definitely has its own rich history, starting in 1894. Some of you may not know that the grounds on which Woronora stands today were originally intended to be a racecourse. It wasn't until the mayor of Rockdale at that time, John Bomer, decided that instead of a place where people could bet on horses, what the area really needed was a place to remember loved ones. Acknowledging that Sydney's population was quickly growing, and the two established cemeteries in the city would soon run out of space. The cemetery, like ESMP, has had a few name changes since its inception. It was officially named the Woronora General Cemetery in March of 1894, but was also referred to as the Illawarra Suburban Cemetery and later the Sutherland Cemetery. A few months after being named, tenders were accepted for the trenching and clearing of the land for the proposed site in June, and by August, this work was complete and the fencing was in progress. So, Woronora already seems to have had a smoother run than its counterpart. The cemetery was the size of approximately 112 acres in the beginning, and was initially subdivided in two denominational lots in 1894, before final changes to the lots were made in April of 1895. The size of the lots were the Church of England with 28 acres, the Roman Catholic section with 19 acres, the Presbyterian section was provided with 7 acres, the Wesleyan section 10 acres, the Congregational with 3 acres, a Baptist section of 2 acres, a Lutheran area of 1 acre, a Methodist section of 2 acres, a Jewish section of 1 acre, and an unsectarian section or general cemetery of 2 acres. Woronora Cemetery was laid out in a garden-esque style and was originally designed to feature a circular focal point from which denominational lots could swirl off, as historian Dr. Lisa Murray describes it, like flower petals. The landscape has been altered over the years. However, parts of the original design still exist in the form of the main road structure. It was described in December of 1895 in the Sydney Morning Herald as the most systematically planned burial ground in the colonies. By this time, a £1,000 government grant had been spent to clear and fence the cemetery, as well as construct the main road through the cemetery and plant trees near the fences. That amount of money approximates to $223,467 today. It was reported between 20 and 30 burials had already taken place and could comfortably accommodate for 70,000 graves in total. Within the space of 1 year from tenders, the cemetery was dedicated for the interment of the dead on the 2nd of April 1895. But interestingly, an interment had already taken place the day before, on the 1st of April. Helen Willow, aged 28 of Cogra, was laid to rest in Methodist Section A. However, the cemetery's registrar has the first interment listed as 6-month-old Muriel King, buried on the 13th of April 1895. This record indicated an interestingly sad pattern within the Sutherland area at the time. Records indicate that around 41% of the cemetery's burials over the first 11 years were of children, predominantly under the age of 10. The vast majority of interments were also taking place in denominational portions of the cemetery. Only 6 burials within the first 11 years were in the general section. Just a year after the cemetery began interments, in 1896 residents near the site complained of its porous and swampy nature, and it impinging on a watercourse which ran through the properties of several settlers below the cemetery. It appears drainage was a major issue for the cemetery from its establishment and throughout much of the early 20th century. Eventually, the Department of Lands provided £30 to undertake the work, with further money spent in 1902 to fix the issue. Months after the first interment, regulations regarding the management of the cemetery were gazetted on the 17th of September 1895. The regulations stipulated that every monument, tomb, tablet, gravestone, or any other structure in the cemetery would have to be approved by the trustees before added. The trustees concluded that it would be better to have the cemetery beautified by trees and flowers rather than an array of monuments of all shapes and sizes in various stages of decay. The trustees for the cemetery were appointed by the minister. 2 individuals were appointed to represent the general public: Joseph Hector Carruthers from the district of St George and Frederick Samuel Ellis Holt from the district of Sutherland, along with others chosen to represent the various religious denominations. By the time the cemetery had been established, mortuary trains had become an accepted addition to funeral proceedings, with the Rookwood Mortuary Train line a popular way to transport the coffins and mourners to the necropolis. So it only made sense that one would exist for Woronora Cemetery too. The train line was an 822-metre track, which extended from Sutherland Railway Station to Woronora Cemetery. It crossed over East Parade near the junction of Linden Street. In 1892, and prior to the opening of the cemetery, the New South Wales government authorised the construction of the line, with costs projected to reach £2,500. That's over $500,000 in today's value. The survey for the railway line was completed by the Department of Railways in 1895, and by the 20th of July 1900, the line was open for use. The brick platform, which contained a shed used as a waiting room, was situated on what is now the central administrative area of the cemetery, with cabbage tree palms lining the platform. Trains would depart for the cemetery from Central Station platforms 12 through 19, and an additional 2 mortuary sheds were installed at Sydenham and Cogra stations. This is quite possibly due to these stations' proximity to established Marrickville and St George hospitals. Up to 8 coffins could be conveyed by the funeral train to the cemetery at a time, and they were unloaded from the train onto a 4-wheeled cart. Fares were charged according to the class of the trip. However, the deceased rode for free. If the person requiring burial was a pauper, special free tickets could be given by the Chief Secretary to the deceased's loved ones. The line existed for over 4 decades, with the final service conducted in 1944, and the line was officially closed on the 23rd of May 1947. At some point between 1955 and 1961, the train line appears to have been covered so that no visible trace remains of the line or platform today. As previously mentioned in episode 1, the creation of Central Station meant that relocation of graves from Devonshire Street Cemetery needed to take place. Woronora was no exception. In 1901, 33 graves were relocated to Woronora Cemetery, 2 Church of England, 13 Roman Catholic, 15 Presbyterian, 1 Wesleyan, and 2 Congregational. The cemetery also contains a number of private family memorials to those who were killed during the First World War. One notable burial includes the memorial of John Percy James Derwent, who was killed in France in February of 1917. His memorial contains a marble medallion portrait of Derwent and is located in Anglican Section 1. So we've spoken a bit about the build and the first days of Woronora, but what about the people who actually lived on the cemetery grounds? The first superintendent of the cemetery was Charles Tilly Fripp, an alderman of West Botany Council who held the position until his death in 1907. Thomas Smith, Fripp's son-in-law, took over operations, and for a time local residents nicknamed the cemetery Tom's Orchard. Smith retired in 1947. His son, Charles Thomas, then took over until 1968. By that point, the cemetery had been managed by the family for a total of 73 years. The custodian's residence was originally in a lot with a size of over 10 acres in the northwestern part of the cemetery. The Sexton's cottage was probably built between 1895 and 1896. The cottage was constructed using locally quarried sandstone near today's portion of the Salvation Army. And the familial work with the cemetery didn't just extend to the men. Fripp's daughters, Eva and Florence, also assisted with the cemetery's operations, occasionally conveying coffins on a hand-drawn cart from Sutherland Railway Station to the cemetery. The residence was later used as a meeting space for the trustees before it was demolished in about 1929 to make room for the crematorium. Fred Smith, the son of the second sexton Thomas Smith and Eva Nay Fripp, described life in the first residence, where he was born in September of 1907. Fred described the residence as a 3-bedroomed house in the bush. There was no running water or electricity, and the family used a fuel stove and kept rainwater tanks. There was a well, a tennis court, and a vegetable garden on the property, and the family also kept a cow, providing them with fresh milk. The property contained a fernery and was surrounded by several tree plantings, which came under threat numerous times from bushfires. Other early structures built on the site included a small office and a 2-room building. It included a room for grave diggers and another for railway employees, once the cemetery railway line was constructed. The 2 rooms had a shared fireplace in the dividing wall, and in the gravedigger's room was a bell suspended from a rafter which was used to signal the train's departure. A second residence was also eventually built, and included a tennis court and an air raid shelter. During the Depression era, many Sydneysiders became creative when it came to earning an income. This extended to the daily goings-on in the cemetery, with the opportunity for individuals to sell flowers outside the cemetery. The trend raised concerns due to lack of regulation, and even though permits were introduced for a short period of time, by August of 1934, selling became restricted to private property. A few months later, in January of 1935, an incident took place on cemetery grounds that garnered a fair amount of media attention. The story goes like this. 2 policemen responded to a report about 3 men stealing chickens in the Woronora area. The individuals were apprehended on Menai Road in a lorry containing 160 chickens. 2 of the men were driven back to the police station in the lorry, with the other being driven back in the other policeman's sidecar. However, at one point, one of the men within the lorry took control of the steering wheel and veered the lorry into a shop front, giving the other apprehended man in the sidecar an opportunity to escape into Woronora Cemetery. The policeman called out to the man, weaving in and out of the tombstones, but the man refused to heed his warnings, and a shot was fired. The bullet ricocheted off a gravestone and struck the man, who later died in St. George Hospital. Just like ESMP, Woronora also contains above-ground vaults. However, only 3 above-ground vaults appear in Woronora Memorial Park. There are 2 in Anglican Section 1, that of Pascoe and the Warren families, which date to the 1920s. From 1968, the cemetery's trustees began considering a site suitable for above-ground tombs and settled on the southeastern area, today's Roman Catholic above-ground vaults, after test drilling indicated the area consisted of a shelf rock 2 to 4 feet below the surface. Ideas for a crematorium to be built on the site started a little earlier at Woronora than they did at ESMP. Support for the construction of a crematorium at the cemetery was given by Sutherland Shire Council as early as 1910, but despite the apparent interest, no action took place regarding the crematorium until recommendations were accepted by the trustees in November of 1931. Close to 2 years would pass before plans were lodged with the Department of Health and Sutherland Shire Council. As the location for the crematorium was in part of the unsectarian section, bodies in this area were relocated to the remaining portion of that section. Construction commenced in July of 1933. Sutherland Shire Council later reported the cost of the building ended up being over double the originally set out price. Local media publication The Propeller reported 250 tonnes of cement and 400,000 bricks were used in its construction. The Woronora Crematorium, the third to open in New South Wales and the fifth in Australia, was officially opened on the 21st of April 1934 by Frank Chaffee, Chief Secretary of New South Wales. Newspaper reports at the time proclaimed the building to be the most elaborate in the Southern Hemisphere. The crematorium contained two chapels, the Court of Remembrance, including the Book of Remembrance, today in the Centenary Court, columbarium, and a cremation chamber. Cremation niches in the columbarium were sold for between £10 and £21 in those days, in the Court of Remembrance for £6 and 6 shillings, and in the gardens for between £3 and £10. The Eastern, now South Chapel, could accommodate 300 to 350 people and contained a waiting room and office. The West Chapel accommodated 200 to 250 people. Between the two chapels, the Court of Remembrance contained a lotus pool with cloisters surrounding it. Records indicate that originally the court had no roof, and by 1953 the court was covered and the pool was filled in. At the rear of the building, connected to the West Chapel by a colonnade, was the Cremation Chamber, with the chimney stack of the Cremation Chamber concealed within a belfry-like tower, measuring 72 feet in height. The first cremation took place on the 25th of April 1934, and interestingly, the first night cremation in Australia took place at Woronora Crematorium on the 19th of December 1934. By September 1935, 327 cremations had been undertaken at the crematorium, with the regulations of the Woronora General Cemetery and Crematorium gazetted that same month. There was originally a lot of pushback to the inclusion of a crematorium at Woronora, but not for the reason you might think. It was acknowledged in initial protest letters that cremation was a practical and individual choice, but that the crematorium did not belong in Sutherland because it would stifle the growth of the area. Concerns were also raised about whether cremations could be smelt around the cemetery and surrounding streets, and a rumour did the rounds for decades about bodies being taken out of coffins so the coffins could be reused. None of these concerns and misinformation dampened the operations of the crematorium, though. The memorial gardens have expanded over decades to become a key feature of the Woronora Memorial Park. The Rose Garden has been in place since the establishment of the crematorium in 1934 and has expanded in the layout of a stained glass window. By the 1990s, the Rose Gardens had reached between 11,000 and 12,000 roses in 3.2 hectares of gardens. Between 1989 and 1994, additions and alterations of the garden memorial sections were undertaken, including the construction of timber gazebos and a fountain, and establishment of the Henry Lawson and Mary Gilmore Gardens. In April of 1989, Ron Elliott designed a new office building for the cemetery, south of the earlier administration building, and tenders were called in July that year. The new office was opened in October 1990 and even won an award at the 1991 Sutherland Shire Council's Civic Design Awards. In September 2009, monumental stonemasons Frank DeMarco and Sons drew up plans for a new mausoleum to be constructed opposite the crypts of Christ the Redeemer, already added to the site in the late 1990s. The structure would consist of individual precast concrete vaults interlinked to form a building, with marble granite, timber, and glass finishing. The main mausoleum building would feature both internal and external crypts, as well as a number of smaller blocks containing outdoor crypts and some family vaults, completed with paved areas and landscaping. Approval of construction for the mausoleum was granted by Sutherland Shire Council in August 2010. The Gardens of the Pieta Mausoleum, comprising of 544 indoor and outdoor crypts in total, was officially opened on the 27th of October 2012. In 2010, work began on the installation of the Stations of the Cross Memorial in the Roman Catholic section of the cemetery, designed as the first designated area for Catholics opting for cremation. During excavations that year, a previously undetected spring began to flow through the site, despite it being in the locale of the highest point in the cemetery. The design, layout, and style of the installation was completed by Nadia Lanfranco. The memorial features 14 stations, each standing 2 meters high, carved from granite and arranged in a circular walk. A 3.5 meter sculpture of Jesus Christ occupies the center of the circular area in a water feature, and it was officially unveiled on the 14th of September 2013. Another notable memorial at Woronora includes the Doorway of Hope, officially opened on the 11th of April 2010 by Senator Michael Forshaw to remember Australia's missing persons. The first to be recognised in the memorial was Daniel Morecambe, who went missing at the age of 13 from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Woronora Memorial Park estimates around 95,000 people have been buried in the cemetery and 180,000 have been cremated. The earliest graves in the cemetery are located close to the main office building in the centre of the cemetery and contain the remains of some of the district's colonial pioneers and identities, including Frederick Samuel Ellis Holt of the Holt family and Daniel Lobb, who established a coaching business in the area in the 1880s. Also from the Lobb family was nurse Kate Lobb, who, according to local historian Merle Kavanagh, travelled the Shire in her sulky, tending to the sick and delivering babies. She is buried in Anglican Monumental 243. Other notable burials include the first timber merchant in the area, William Burns, the Aboriginal activist Herbert Stanley, or Bert Groves, the author Helena Sumner Locke, and the public school inspector and historian Carl Reginald Cramp. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Eternal Stories on the history of Woronora Memorial Park. Over our next 2 episodes, we'll be heading back to Eastern Sydney, only this time it'll be 100 years ago, the time and place of 2 of ESMP's most notorious internments, gangland figure rivals Tilly Devine and Kate Lee. For more information on this episode and the podcast, feel free to head to our Facebook pages under Woronora Memorial Park and Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park, or on LinkedIn at Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries, New South Wales. The website again is www.smcnsw.org.au. And of course, thank you for listening.